Again, good morning everybody, and welcome here today to Scandinavia House, and a massive thank you to our kind hosts for having us here today. And a warm welcome to our panel discussion. Welcome to those who are joining us online. We're thrilled to have everyone here in person, standing room only at the back there, as well as those that are joining us. Today's conversation is going to be centered around mobilizing capital for the energy transition and growing a pipeline of investable and impactful climate projects in emerging and developing markets. These investments are of absolute paramount to develop to these emerging markets and to ensure sustainable growth, to combat catastrophic climate change and warming, and to safeguard our precious ecosystems. By estimates of our friends at the Blended Finance Task Force, by 2030 we'll need an additional $2.4 trillion for climate action in these economies, excluding China. However, currently less than 20% of that total investment funding comes from climate finance. Relying solely on philanthropy and donor funding from governments will not bridge this considerable gap. The encouraging news, of course, is that the private sector can play a significant role with advancements in technology, market data, and collaboration, making climate investments increasingly attractive. Nevertheless, we have to address two key critical challenges to facilitate short-term growth in climate finance. First of all, that's the project pipeline. There is definitely no lack of capital, as I'm sure most of you know, but the private sector often struggles to identify viable projects and opportunities in these regions. Project preparation facilities can oftentimes be small, hard to access, and detached from funding mechanisms, as well as risk mitigation instruments. Alarmingly, project finance in these countries has declined from $91 billion in 2019 to less than $60 billion in 2022. Secondly, another major thing we need to address is the cost of capital. Financing options are frequently unavailable, they're inaccessible, or prohibitively expensive, and this includes currency hedging mechanisms or local currency finance. International investors involved can often lack familiarity or a physical presence in these markets, which can lead to perceived or real political and counterparty risks. Nevertheless, data consistently shows that these risks are often lower than what they seem. And so to address this, catalytic instruments such as blended finance can play a pivotal role by combining commercial debt and concessional capital, by providing risk insurance and guarantee instruments, as well as design stage grants and technical assistance funds. However, we do and we will face a significant shortfall in dedicated financing instruments in these markets. As I heard yesterday at a Convergence blended finance event, there's a staggering projected gap for mitigation only at $850 billion by 2030. So, with that in mind, our aim for this morning's conversation is to explore ways to close those gaps with a special focus on improving project preparation and leveraging catalytic climate capital. We're fortunate today, of course, to be joined by a distinguished panel of leaders from philanthropies, international agencies within the climate finance landscape, and the private sector. They'll share with us specific on-the-ground experience and valuable insights on preparing climate transition investments in these economies. And we're bound to learn a lot today, and there'll be ample opportunity for those in the audience today to ask questions. However, before I introduce our esteemed panelists, a few housekeeping items to note. The restrooms are located in the basement. I recommend taking the elevator unless you want to walk down 4 or 5 flights of stairs like I just found out myself. The event is being live streamed, so please, if you're walking in front of the camera, please duck, and do keep it quiet if you're collecting food or coffee, which I'm sure all of you will need this morning. So, with those details covered, it is my absolute pleasure today to introduce one of our panelists for opening remarks. Please join me in welcoming E.J. Okeke, our esteemed Managing Director for Catalytic Climate Capital at RMI and a colleague of mine, to the stage. EJ's leadership at RMI focuses on catalyzing climate capital across emerging markets in the Americas, Asia, Africa, and she brings over 2 decades of experience working at the intersection of private and public finance and international development funding, driving sustainable inclusive growth across the US, the Americas, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America. I'll now turn the floor over to her as she discusses the present opportunities that we have with project preparation facilities.
Clearly very tall. Thank you, Ben, for that warm introduction and opening remarks to set the scene for today's discussion. Good morning, everyone, and welcome once again to our panel discussion on risk to reward. Before I begin, I think it's important for us to set the context and discuss, as I discuss what we're doing at RMI in the Global South, and specifically what I'm focused on in catalytic climate capital. I'd like to first of all set the context and talk about how we got here. We're all quite familiar with the data, but it's important to remind ourselves. When you look at least developed countries in the Global South, most of which are in Sub-Saharan Africa, they contribute less than 4% of greenhouse gas emissions, but will bear the brunt of climate change. Even though, for a lot of them, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa and in Southeast Asia, 3.6 billion lack access to reliable electricity. But even within that group, only 20% have access to any energy at all. The battle of climate change will be won and lost in the Global South. Climate change affects all of us, but for a number of people in the Global South, it is a matter of survival. And it's important as these countries seek to industrialize, seek to improve energy access in their populations, that we support them to do that in a sustainable and a decarbonized manner. We've set some ambitious goals as a collective of bringing 11,000 gigawatts of clean energy into the global energy supply as a minimum requirement to keep our goal of 1.5 degrees C within reach. In order to achieve that, we will need massive amounts of capital in addition to other things. We estimate that we need about $6 trillion to, at a minimum, just to avoid the most catastrophic impact of climate change. And today, only 31% of that need is being met through the various forms of funding, both public and private sector. Let's see. If we delve a bit deeper into the global finance gap, as mentioned, $6 trillion is needed to meet our goals. We have seen tremendous growth in the last decade in the amount of capital that's flowing into energy transition. But that needs to grow 7-fold for us to meet our goals. And to put that also into perspective, when we look at the pool of capital, or the different pools of capital available, we find that a lot of them aren't going to the regions that have the most need and the most opportunity. And it's important that we understand why that is. There are a couple of reasons. But at RMI, our journey into the Global South started about 8 years ago with our program in the island. And part of our move into the Global South was in order to address what we felt was a need to move beyond being a think tank to being a do tank, and rolling up our sleeves and being part of the solution to the climate crisis. Our focus has been on capacity building and on providing access to funding for projects in these regions. Our program was anchored in the Caribbean island, where we've been focusing on resilience and decarbonization away from fossil fuels. In sub-Saharan Africa, which is our second oldest program, our focus there has been on energy access and green growth. And Southeast Asia is our most recent program where we're working on coal transition and decarbonized growth. And in all of these regions, we complement our program and our efforts with robust capacity building focused on energy transition. How do we build the workforce of the future to support the energy transition? And then CFAN, which is our Climate Finance Access Network, ensuring that projects and countries get access to finance, climate finance resources that are available. And as we've worked in the Global South, specifically in the islands, we've built out our capabilities in a very modular fashion. So all of this has been demand-driven. So we haven't entered into these markets with a preconceived notion of what they need. We've started with what the government has requested of us and built out our program slowly. We started with working with a number of utilities and public sector agencies on energy planning, looking at integrated resource plans to enable the energy transition in those markets. Subsequent to that, we started rolling up our sleeves and working on project support, project development support. And we've complemented that with our work in capacity building, which I touched on earlier. And of course, the other module has been on climate finance. So we've built out these capabilities, and right now we're in a position as an institution to look at how we can take what we've incubated in the Caribbean and replicate that in other markets in the Global South. We're calling that our radical implementation phase. Given the urgency of the situation, we want to be a big part of the solution and be on the ground working with our partners and stakeholders to implement projects and programs that are needs-based and complementary to what the countries want. Now, I'd like to highlight one of the products that I'm currently working on developing and scaling. And as I mentioned, this product was really born out of what we've seen on the ground working in the Global South for the past 8 years. One big challenge that we see is looking at how we can develop a robust pipeline of bankable projects that the climate finance available can support. Now, there are a number of, and I'm just going to walk around a bit, there are a number of issues that we feel have led to some of the challenges that we have in developing that bankable project pipeline. And 90% of projects fail at that early stage project development process. And that's where we feel we can bring in our technical expertise, our implementation teams on the ground, and really add value and deliver impact in these countries. There are a couple of reasons for the challenges that we've identified. One is the regulatory and policy barriers, ensuring that the markets have the appropriate regulatory framework, political stability, policies in place that create an enabling environment that can help these projects proliferate. The other key issue is what I like to call the risk-reward dislocation in some of these markets. I jokingly tell my team that early stage project funding is like venture capital without the upside. So, so you take all of the risk, and the upside is limited or capped at the very best. I mean, I worked at DFI for many years, and we would work on several utility scale thermal IPPs. And oftentimes we'd encounter developers that have been developing projects for 5, 7 years. We come in year 6 as the lender to complete the development, and we'd always push back on the developer in their ability to recover their costs, right? So you take all this risk, and even with large lender groups, you're negotiating your ability to cover your actual costs spent developing the project. So lots of risk and very little reward. The third is maybe not risk aversion, but a risk perception issue, where the perception of risk in these markets, which are new to a number of private investors, is not congruent with the realities on the ground. So the perception of risk is greater than the actual risk on the ground. And so in response to this, given our particular capabilities, we have set up a project preparation and development facility, not a fund, but a facility. And that facility is meant to support early stage activities, everything from planning to project definition, resource validation, techno-economic feasibility studies, all the things that are necessary to develop projects and de-risk projects and attract the private sector. We marry that with our different programs in capacity building, with a focus on equity, resilience, and justice. We look at improving capacity within governments to access finance, upskill the local developer community as well. In a lot of these markets, when we come in, there aren't always developers with the requisite expertise to build projects. And we have very much a partnership model when we go into countries, because we want to have local developer capacity built out over time. So even as we engage and bring in expertise, we ensure we're doing that in partnership with local institutions. The next slide is a snapshot of, of the way we see the project development cycle. Some of you may be familiar with this. So in terms of the development phase and the risk associated with that, the highest risk segment is early on in the development cycle, where you're looking at concept development, project definition, and project preparation. The next step, which we also support in, if there isn't developer capacity to take on that role, we can support with funding and capacity, expertise on feasibility and the development. This should take us to financial close. And at that point, ideally, the expectation is that projects have been developed to a stage where local and international private sector institutions should be able to come in. And we don't just bring them in at the end. They work with us and know what we're working on even early on. And so there's always that iterative process between our partners in the private sector to make sure that the projects are being developed to a quality that will result in funding. And over here is an overview of the sort of how we're dimensioning the facility. So it's not a blended finance facility, because blended means you take concessional, you mix with private, and hopefully lower the cost of capital to the obligors. Here it's more of a segmented facility, where we're looking at working with our partners in the philanthropic space and our partners in impact investing ecosystem to bring in different pools of capital at different stages and with different return profiles. So we've flipped, in a way, the traditional risk-reward framework, where philanthropic and grant funding is used in the earlier stage to de-risk some of that early stage work, and then we partner with other investors as we build out the project, as we roll out the project development cycle. Now, this is something we have tested in the Caribbean. Right now, we've got a mature pipeline of 350 megawatts in the Caribbean that we are developing. We've already secured grant funding from bilateral to support some of the early stage work, which we're progressing. And we are in the process of concluding with an impact investor to also come in to support our work in the Caribbean. Now, there is a lot of interest in the ecosystem to replicate something like this in different markets. The Caribbean is great, but it's small. And there's a lot of work that we need to do in other countries in the Global South. And our programs in Sub-Saharan Africa are anchored in Nigeria, but we're looking at building that out. And in Southeast Asia, we're looking at a program in Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. And we're working with an impact investor on our project preparation facility there. I think at this point, I'd love to continue this conversation with our panel. And I'm going to hand this back to Ben. Thank you.
Thanks so much, EJ. As she has so succinctly outlined, we are facing a number of barriers. There are ways to read between the lines and to unlock capital for these projects. However, we're here today really to talk about those practical solutions and tools, and the experience of our esteemed panelists today can walk us through some of their on-the-ground experience in actually delivering solutions to those investments, focusing on things like investment strategies to de-risk projects, as well as building solid pipelines of energy transition projects. No small feat, but we do have the exact people in the room that are able to open our eyes to these avenues. I'm now going to ask our panelists to please take their seats. The names should be on the seats as well. So it's my great pleasure, first of all, to welcome Marcos Neto. He is the director of UNDP's Sustainable Finance Hub. He leads the work of the hub and its implementation in over 140 countries around the world, in collaboration, of course, with UN sister agencies and other development agencies and the private sector. He co-chairs the executive board of the Business Call to Action and Connecting Business. And he's also the head of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. Welcome, Marcos. Sitting to his left is Nicole Esepi. She's the Director of Energy Innovation at Bezos Earth Fund, an advocate for accelerating the solutions to addressing global energy and industry transition. Nicole works to increase innovation and collaboration and scale up climate resilient investments to achieve net zero. To her left is Christopher Marks. Sorry, I couldn't see there. Christopher Marks is the managing director.
Discrete profile.
Christopher Marks is the managing director, head of growth markets and innovative financing at MUFG. Christopher has an impressive history and worked in financial markets and sector advisory across the public and private sector for more than 20 years. Chris has also worked for the Africa Development Bank in Abidjan and the International Monetary Fund, Afritac. And finally, last but not least, Astrid Monrath, head of the Global Infrastructure Facility, previously the Director of Climate Finance at the European Climate Foundation, and also Director of Operations at the Africa Development Bank. Astrid has years of experience in private and public sectors and is committed to using finance to achieve SDGs and the agreement on and the Paris Agreement on climate. So, with that said, our esteemed panelists all introduced. It's therefore my pleasure to start with our first question, and panelists will have about 5 minutes to answer each question. Please feel free to have some free-flowing conversation between yourselves as well. Marcos, you're leading the global initiative in developing countries on accelerating sustainable finance. And as EJ just said, 90% of projects tend to fail in that early stage. Can you tell us a little bit more about the challenges that you've faced in these emerging and developing economies in mobilizing finance? And what approaches has UNDP put in place in terms of partnering as well with the country and with other organizations to addressing these gaps?
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, my good friend Vikram, for the invitation. Let me put it a little bit in the context. We at the United Nations Development Program, we have a few kind of moonshots, if you want, to 2025 that we put it out there. Two of those are relevant for this conversation, and they need to be looked together. One is to connect 500 million people to renewable sources of energy. The other one is to align $1 trillion to the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. So the two comes together, right? You can't do one without the other. If you come down from that big global moonshot down to the project level, I think the example that I want to give it is something we work with RMI as well. It is what we call the African Mini Grid Program, right? We are putting forward in 21 countries in Africa, the AMP as we call, and in those 21 countries, there are 376 million people without connection, right? So out of 500 million goal that we have, that you've got a big chunk of this. It's also pretty clear that as a distributed renewable energy system, mini grids are perhaps the cheapest one and the most affordable one. Now, we are not a financial institution. I'll let others deal with it. So we come at that element that you talked about, the regulatory challenge. A lot that we do as UNDP follows in our direct work on the kind of policy de-risking. Now, take the sector as a whole. We actually have a methodology quite well established to de-risk renewable energy investments. We are the ones that were behind the big solar power program up in Morocco back on the day, right? So that policy de-risking is very important because it provides certainty to investors. It provides certainty, going forward, and it can lower to some degree the cost of capital, but it's not sufficient. It comes back to the financing, the risk side. What we've been trying to do on that side is to look at large scale, right? And if you step back, perhaps the first message I would like you to remember here is the problem is not a problem of lack of money. There's plenty of liquidity in the world. There's plenty of money in the world, right? The lady beside me has plenty of money herself. An endless pot of money. So that's not the problem, right? The problem is the money doesn't flow. Now, part of the problem is project preparation, but I would actually argue that there are plenty of projects out there. They just don't fit the risk profile. So it's not that there are no projects. It is that the projects don't fit the risk profile. So we're going to have to deal with that, right? So one of the things we are trying to do is to create mechanisms that allows for a reduction in cost of capital at a larger scale. So not at the project level. I actually don't think we're going to get out of this mess in time for my children to have a life, right? Project by project. I think we need to elevate the process of blending and de-risking to attract large sums of capital market money, $135 trillion of asset under management. This money is not coming for projects, guys. This money buys bond. It's all in the ETFs. So how do you de-risk thematic bonds? We have worked in $14 billion of issuance in the last 3 years. SDGs bond, green bond, and whatever. Now, we don't do the financial stuff. We do the thematic stuff, right? The framework. We just launched, Senegal just launched it last week, right? It's sustainable finance framework. We designed that with them and the World Bank and others, and now we're moving to the issuance. Now, you still have to do the project preparation behind the bonds, right? Because the money comes, the money has to go through what the theme, the framework is, right? But I think we need to look from an international point of view, less on projects, more on very large volumes. And then at the national level, deal with the project. I had the last piece of data that I'll give it. The G20 put a report out there as part of the MDB reform process. Larry Summers and Sink put up a report there. They say that we're looking at $3 trillion. What was interesting to that report, because this number varies everywhere, is how they split. They actually said that is $1 trillion of climate global finance or whatever global stuff, and $2 trillion of domestic resource mobilization. We tend to forget this conversation about local taxation, budget alignment, right? In the end, developing countries are going to be the #1 financiers of this transition. There's $56 trillion on developing countries' national budgets between today and 2025. How you align that money is almost more important than how you align global flows of money.
Thanks for that, Marcus. Very insightful. Oh, sorry, Nicole, did you want to?
Can I add a comment to
Yes,
that?
absolutely.
I think it's very good speaking. I mean, it's pretty common sense, isn't it? We all know there's enough money out there, but it's strategically not getting linked to the right needs. And that sounds so much common sense, but we really got to look at how we can link the capital. Now, every type of capital has special values, and we've got to make sure those special values are linking to the right deals and there's enough bankable deals. But for me, I must say, like yourself, we've spent all our career in this industry. But when you break it down, we're not saying anything, Einstein. This is basic. But the industry is just not accelerating it. So at the core of this, and I think this might come to the next question, is that we really got to think smarter about who's partnering and how we reward in this industry. We need to reward execution and stop rewarding just people who come out with targets and headlines.
Fantastic addition there. So Nicole, as Michael said, we can't always lower the cost of capital through de-risking, and the money's not always flowing to the right places, of course. So how are we going to address the risk profile of projects? That's a question for everyone. But specifically for Bezos Earth Fund, you play a really unique role in climate action by providing sort of early, flexible stage capital. This always allows sort of innovations and communities to develop and sort of test innovative solutions that might not have already been tested on the ground. Sort of at which phase in the project life cycle can philanthropic dollars come in and be used for most significant impact, especially in emerging markets? And how can philanthropies form impactful partnerships with other investors and funding bodies to ensure that these models are scaled, like Marcos said, on a global scale?
Certainly. So it really adds to what I just said. Every capital is special, and every capital has its special values. When you talk particularly about philanthropy, and for example, Bezos Earth Fund, we are 100% grant-based. So in some ways, it is extra special because we're looking to be catalytic, bold, move markets and accelerate in this particular decisive decade. But in order to do that, we need to sometimes take high risks. And philanthropy can do that in obviously a very strategic and very well-organised manner. Now, what's really important to us is really think about who we are. And it's really essential. This is a live economic ecosystem. So philanthropy, just doing good, is not sufficient. And we are a strong believer at that at Bezos Earth Fund. What we need to do is be philanthropy, do good, but do good as is needed in the gaps in this live ecosystem. It's not sufficient just to do good. And so what we like to do is see who the experts are or the voices that aren't being heard, who have the talent that should be brought on, and see what are the types of collaborations and partnerships we need to do. And that's why we're very proud to work with RMI in this industry also. But it's also thinking a little bit out the box. Things do have to change, and it's great to have these existing partnerships, but we've got to rethink. It's just not going at the speed and scale we all need to. So we've got to think about different types of strategic partnerships, and we've got to, just to my earlier comment, think a little bit more about the execution. It's not about just getting talented people together and good thoughts together. It's bigger than ideas and thoughts. We've got to think what will deliver. And for us, we're very focused on this decade. It's about putting our foot on that accelerator and what can we do now to accelerate that end energy system that we're really wanting to do. But I think too, being philanthropy, we obviously are agile. We can take high risks. So in terms of the cycle, we're very much at the lab, so obviously R&D, technology, right up to the market. I mean, in my view, for us to be successful is invest in new technology that's needed, that can get to scale to do the speed that we need. But in addition to that, you're looking at things to actually create the demand or accelerate the supply. But the success for us, it's when the market takes that on and then we exit. Because we should not be seen as subsidies. We are not subsidies. We are a joint collaborator, like many other philanthropies, that's looking to sort of inject our capital in a wise, bold, catalytic way, but also with our partners who are the executors in this industry and the investors to really take it on in the industry. So we're really looking to sort of do that initial push. But really, our success, and obviously taking high risks, we do acknowledge we won't always be successful, but we really do want to do that first push so then the industry takes that forward, and then that's a sign of our success too. And not just success on us, this is a community. It's a success for the industry and for the future community and the future energy system we want to build too.
Thanks, Nicole. Very powerful statement there, and completely agree that we need that sort of early stage R&D and community and capacity building on the ground. And to that point, EJ, earlier you mentioned capacity building was part of RMI's model on empowering local communities, particularly local developer capacity. So following on with that conversation, how will RMI be working in partnership with regional and local stakeholders in the Caribbean, Africa, and Southeast Asia to support project pipeline development and also risk mitigation in the energy transition?
Sure, I think there are a couple of ways that we can support the programs in our region, and we're already doing this. In the area of technical expertise, for instance, I mean, RMI has been working on the energy transition for 40 years. There are very few firms that have the depth of expertise and knowledge that we as an institution have, and that is something that we bring to bear in the programs that we implement. A good example is, in sub-Saharan Africa, we're looking at a couple different verticals, not just in terms of electricity, but also looking at the nexus of electricity and agriculture, electricity and transportation, and electricity and industry. So RMI can bring their expertise working in a lot of other emerging markets, specifically India, Southeast Asia, that have a lot of the similar challenges, and help implement programs in Nigeria, Kenya, and so on. That's one way that we can bring our expertise to bear. Another strength that we have as an institution is in the role that we play as an honest broker in a lot of these conversations. We're able to bring parties together that ordinarily would not be working together. And I'll give a practical example. So prior to coming to RMI, I worked at a utility. I ran a utility in Nigeria. And for those who are familiar with the power sector in Nigeria, there's a lot of need and undersupply. And as a utility, we saw a lot of decentralized energy providers basically cannibalizing customers in our franchise. And RMI helped work with us to come up with a business model on part of their utility innovation program that designs a way that DERs can help complement and supplement grid energy, right? And it's interesting because in Nigeria, I like to say that it is the largest DER market. It's just self-generation with diesel gensets, right? So as a paradigm, a lot of the customers already accept the concept of DERs, but it was working together with the utilities to build out a program that can combine DERs and grid supply, and that's something that RMI was able to work with us on. And then the third area, I think, in addition to partnerships and technical expertise, is just in the area of funding, and that's kind of why we've stood up this PPDF, looking at how we can bring specific pools of capital that can take the kind of risk that we need to take in building out a pipeline in these markets.
Thanks, CJ. Just a short follow-up question to that. You spoke to the capacity building piece. What role does sort of South-South knowledge transfer play in building out these pipelines and creating like communities of practice around the energy transition?
Right. We actually have the Energy Transition Academy, which is a program that's meant to build out the workforce for the energy transition. In a lot of these markets, we have needs, both in terms of bringing in expertise on project preparation and development, but also expertise within public sector institutions, be they utilities or government agencies. And we also, through ETA, can bring in that sort of capacity development. Also, our CFAN program, which is a climate finance access network, embeds advisors over a long period of time in utilities, in public sector agencies, to help them access climate finance to support their programs. So those are some of the programs that are South-South and can also help with knowledge sharing.
Fantastic. Another great answer. So to that point, Astrid, you lead the Global Infrastructure Facility and you've got experience in over 67 countries. I hear you have a remarkable record of mobilizing over 100 billion, the Global Infrastructure Facility, $100 billion in sustainable infrastructure projects. What are some of the key lessons that you've learned over the years in de-risking projects in the energy sector?
Thank you very much to RMI for hosting this really crucial debate on focusing what I consider actually the binding constraint to scaling up and meeting our global targets, which is really the project and program preparation. As some of you know, I've spent most of my life actually in the financial sector, both on the public and the private side, and I just left it because at this point I'd like to contribute to systems change, and that is in the upstream world, I believe. So maybe just a couple of words on the Global Infrastructure Facility. It was created already in 2014 as a G20 initiative, actually, quite visionary at the time, I would say, to exactly address the bottlenecks in upstream project and program preparation. It's an open architecture facility, actually. It works through its 10 member MDBs and technical partners, advising governments in the preparation, readiness assessment, and also project and program structuring for private investment. So that's really the mandate, and it does so in a very collaborative manner with over 60 partners, including a private sector advisory council, where we can connect projects once they are prepared and programs to actual investors on the ground, who bring about $18 trillion in assets under management. So that's the framework of what we do. Yes, we do have a track record of mobilizing quite a bit of capital. The ratio is actually 1 to 100. So every dollar that we invest in project structuring activities leads to $100 actual private sector investment at financial close. This is not estimated PCN, this is real private sector multiplier, excluding commercial DFI investment. It's also important. But I want to be honest also, our conversion rate, so the number of the 166 projects that actually have reached financial close to date, is not what we would like to see. And the reasons for that are exactly what Ije described earlier, is that there is a lot of kind of bottlenecks to overcome on the upstream side of things. So how does the GIF do this? Let me give you a couple of examples on the energy transition. For example, in Malawi, we support the development of the Patamanga hydropower project. It's a country that has 12% on-grid access, putting this PPP together for a 350 megawatt hydropower project that will cost about 600 million in capital, will double the on-grid access in that country. Or another example, in energy transition, as we know, is not that just the energy sector, it's also low carbon transport, for example. In Dakar, the GIF advised on the preparation of the Dakar bus rapid transit system, which is the first electric BRT in Africa, making available 120 electric buses, reducing significantly CO2 in transport and also cutting transport times for people commuting. So these are just some of the examples. And with regards to lessons learned, a number, and to be honest with you, none of this is new, right? But what is new is really just that we currently have finally an enabling and authorizing environment that's focusing on the right issues, and that gives me a lot of hope, I have to say. And we also have new partners like philanthropy who can play quite a catalytic role in this setting. But in terms of lessons learned, there are no shortcuts. It really starts with developing the enabling environment upstream, and then also building government capacity in understanding which projects can be put for private investment and where public finance is needed. And that upstream part is something where the GIF is focusing on. In the energy sector, SOE creditworthiness does remain an important factor that needs to be addressed in collaboration with our MDB technical partners. One of the ways we have done this, for example, is in Vietnam, helping the electric utility get a credit rating, which then gave international investors a bit more comfort and actually avoided having to put a government backstop guarantee into financing. So that was one concrete example how this can be done. And then most importantly, it is really getting to programs. Yeah, I totally agree with everything that has been said. We cannot solve this challenge project by project. We need to move to programmatic approaches. One example how the GIF has done this in Brazil, for example, we have partnered with IFC and Caixa, one of the local public banks, to develop standardized municipal energy efficient street lighting programs. At the moment, the pilot project was for 12 municipalities. 6 have already closed, 3 more are moving towards financial close, and the program is replicated all across Brazil. We are looking how we can deploy similar approaches in other countries. So, you know, standardizing contracts, really making this turnkey solutions also significantly helps the rollout. And then last but not least, I would say, you know, collaboration, and structured, open, honest collaboration. The challenge is such that all of us in this room, we have a role to play. But we don't, you know, work as a system yet. And by not doing so, we fragment the capacity of the poor governments in those emerging markets, and we confuse the private sector, quite frankly. So let's just start improving this. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent response, specifically with regards to, you know, the enabling environment that's necessary in these countries. And another one of those sort of enabling factors, particularly to get project developers involved as well as the private sector, is the cost of capital. It's a major barrier to project finance in emerging markets. So I'm going to pose my next question to the perfect person to answer this question, who's setting the cost of capital on many projects. It's Christopher from MUFG. So how can we address the high cost of financing to attract lower cost capital and reduce, you know, perceived political and counterparty risk? How have you been, you know, dealing with this in some of the projects that you've been working on emerging markets, making sort of finance more attractive and affordable to some of these transition projects?
Ben, thank you. I think I'm going to take your question and take a slightly contrarian tone to the colleagues here. I'm taking advantage of this forum to remind everyone there is no natural market for climate impact investment in the frontier. And MUFG is the largest project finance bank in the world. We are not the target of this conversation. The target are insurance companies and pension funds that do all the infra in New York, in big middle-income markets, in Australia, in Southeast Asia. It is hard, and I'm making the point, Ben, to everyone, because this is all through the week, it's always the private sector. There's a sense that there's lots of money. We said even this morning, lots of money. There is not a lot of money for this market. It has to be very carefully tailored. We indeed, and this is not to be promotional, we have done 12 projects in Africa, over 4 billion euro raised, beautifully engineered, carefully executed deals. And I don't mean South Africa, and I don't mean Morocco, I mean in sub-Saharan Africa. They're jewels, they're beautiful. I'm not denigrating my own work. And they're celebrated, and we get real institutional investors who've never set foot in Africa before. On the margin, as with the projects in the GIF, we get some banks in just to fill in around the edges, because we have to, for some of the clean risk. But these investors, to get them into, and let's take a deal that's much celebrated, it was an exercise in Egypt where we refinanced. Remember, this is not what we're talking about, new greenfield, adaptation-sensitive, resilient infrastructure. This is the refinancing, 19-year money, of an operating solar field, 6 operating solar fields in the Benban Solar Park in Egypt, biggest on the continent. We got 4 investors in that, full cover. And I want to make this very clear. 100% MDB wrap. All these deals, all 12 of those deals, are full wraps. Some guarantees are stronger than others, but we have to proceed. The risk-reward balance is exceedingly delicate, Ben. So I'm taking your cost of capital question, I'm turning it around. There's also a reputational risk question. I've had major investors in the UK turn me down with 100% World Bank wrap in West Africa. 100%. It wasn't a question of credit risk. It was because, remember, investors, not so much whether the money is good at the end of a restructuring process. They don't want to do that. So if they believe there's a disruption potential that is high, or the board won't like it if something unpleasant, which does happen in West Africa, who will stand up to that deal and make the point that it's worthwhile? So what I've come, and we do these deals. We talked about Senegal. I've got 3 deals right now in Senegal, and they're all jewels, and they're all 100% wrapped, and there are the kinds of investors you want in all these projects. But you know, it's a couple $100 million. There's nothing wrong with it, right? This is what we're supposed. But for scale, I've understood it's a different message. And I start with a couple of the progressives, and they're not many. All these deals, maybe 20 investors worldwide. Sadly, not out of this country, because the political economy of ESG is pretty complicated these days. And I don't get a lot of response out of the US. Most of this comes from Canada and from Europe, a little bit out of Asia. Remember, all this is full wrap. It's not credit risk. These are all wrapped deals. Now, to go to scale, and to try to move into the areas that the UNFCCC wants us to actually move into more vulnerable jurisdictions, not Mexico, nothing wrong with Mexico, not wind farms in Chile or Vietnam, middle income, but really go into LDCs and SIDS, number 1. Number 2, to move into adaptation. GHG reduction is important, but I think you're well aware resilience investments have to be accommodated with the kind of people we've gotten into these 12 jewels, but we try to get them into a more complicated platform. So I'm hopeful by the time we get through the GCF board in October, we will make an announcement, and this is an attempt at scale. This is a $1.5 billion platform, 70% adaptation, 30% LDCs and SIDS, and I will tell you, I've pitched to 80 institutions, everybody you've ever heard of, all the sovereign wealth funds in Southeast Asia. It's hard. It's really, really, really hard. So part of the exercise is to make the case it's not to fix climate, because I don't believe at the CIOs of the big Canadian pension funds or the sovereign wealth funds in Southeast Asia, there's a mandate for fixing climate. There is a mandate, and this is how I've sold it to MUFG, who's putting $300 million of their own money in. It's for learning. I'm speaking very openly in this room, we financed all the thermal power plants in Southeast Asia, right? That's what Japan did. We have to learn to do something else. And it's a small amount of money for the bank to try to figure out if we can do more thoughtful. This is not for the ESG annual report, although they may put it in there, but that's not the argument that was made to management. We have to figure out what else we're going to do other than things that we will not be able to do anymore. And indeed, the partners in that platform, in the context of everything the colleagues have said, it's all the philanthropies. I didn't go to Astrid's and my old employer. I didn't go to the multilaterals. I went to the foundations. We have three foundation partners, with a lot of UN specialized agencies that are taking part. It's pretty cool. It's a big revelation for me, having been a multilateral person for a lot of my career. That's not actually where some of the interesting work is going. So Ben, I'm sorry, I've gone a long way from your question.
No.
But I think these are important points. Thank you.
I understand, Nicole, you have to leave at 11. Is that? Yes. No, that's fine.
Sorry.
Thanks.
Oh, do you want me to say?
Yeah, no. You have to leave now, right?
Do you want me to say concluding comments?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry. I'm so sorry. He's giving me nothing.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Anyway, we can always trust you to be a realist and give us some ground truthing, particularly on how to wrap investments and get institutional investors involved.
Look, I'll just say some concluding comments. Sorry, I do have to run. It's a packed day today. But look, I do concur with your comments. I concur with all my panellists. They're all very good experts. But one point I really would like to hone down that he's just said is that it's a fine balance. It's like a musical tune between the risk and the financing. But one thing that astonishes me, and I'm sure or many of us in this room, is that we all have this will, we all talk about we want to be part of the solution, but in these negotiations, the day-to-day, it doesn't matter if you're in New York, London, Paris, Tokyo, Nigeria, South Africa, it doesn't matter. Every party's still coming with their top 10 points. So if we really want to find a better profile between matching that risk with the financing, we've really got to rethink what is the future models we want. It's not just looking at my past returns, expecting it tomorrow with different types of systems, different types of projects. We need to rethink that whole system. And so I'd like to just conclude on saying that it's about linking the financing, rethinking the risks, but it's also about the bigger system change. Thank you so much, everyone, and congratulations to RMI as always. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole.
Now, can I come in here? Because I think I'll pick up on the point of changing the system, right? And pricing risk. Now, Chris' point that it's difficult to do the things with full wrap, whatever. The whole thing that makes his life difficult, all of our life difficult, started with a mispricing of risk. Don't take it personally if anybody here working for the credit rating agencies. But there's a fundamental problem with the credit rating agencies, right? We at UNDP have released a report a few months back in which we have proved that Africa, the miscalculation of risk in the continent of Africa costs African $75 billion a year. Because the credit rating agencies don't know, let's be honest, how to price the risk in Africa. They don't know. They don't have people on the ground, right? So it's a misperception of our risk that is much lower than actually is, but is real. You need to figure out $75 billion extra, because that is the cost of capital, the extra cost of capital that is being given to the continent because 3 unelected companies, right, play a role, which is overburdening to the system, right? So it starts there, on the upstream side, as our colleague said, we have to change the system, right? And we have to look differently on how we are calculating this risk, right? It's the same with debt. Folks saying a debt is a debt. I would argue that if you're contracting a debt today in a country to make sure that your economy can sustain the next hurricane, that shouldn't be treated the same way as a debt to pay, salaries, right? Now, we don't have the system to do that. The debt sustainability analysis of the IMF don't consider that, right? So those are some of the bottlenecks at a very large systemic issue, not taking away anything from the project preparation. We still need that stuff. But all of those things will make it easier to mobilize the capital, right? But we don't talk a lot about that. We kind of take the current system, being on debt, being on credit rating, as a given. It's like a sacrosanct, came from God. Actually hasn't.
Thanks so much. It's a very poignant points there. And on that specific subject of the changes that we need to have, the chat about the 100 billion. Let's put that aside for a second here. What changes, Astrid, do we need to see really in the overarching financial system, in the context particularly of multilateral development bank reform? What specific changes do you see as sort of necessary in order to utilize that scarce public money to leverage more private capital?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a key question. And let me just say, when I was in the private sector, I used to think like Chris, right? I mean, MDBs are complicated and slow. Let's just work with philanthropy and we'll get it done. But I'm back in the multilateral system now because actually MDBs do certain things really well and they can also enable scale, and that's what they should be doing. But it really then depends on that they allocate the scarce public funding where it has the highest leverage, and also that, you know, in doing so, we enable standardization to get to scale. So I like to look at it across the project life cycle. In the development phase, you know, you still need a lot of work on enabling environment. You need a lot of kind of risk capital to be put to work. That's where MDBs can help and should really focus their efforts. Once you get into the construction phase already, you can start to bring in the private sector that's willing to take a bit more risk. And then in the operating phase, quite frankly, there's no reason why any DFI MDBs should hold operating assets on their balance sheet. And I think that's one of the transformations that needs to happen. There are some great examples how this can be done. When I was at the African Development Bank, my colleagues actually engineered the first synthetic securitization of MDB assets, the room to run transaction. Actually, it was arranged by mariners out of the US. You know, the template to do this across MDBs is in the drawer. It can be deployed, it can be de-risked today. So that's one of the very concrete systemic solutions that can happen. But in order for that to happen, I also would like to support the point that our colleague from Bezos Earth Fund made earlier. We need to get the incentives right? I mean, MDBs today are still rewarded on their own account lending volume. That needs to change. They need to be held accountable to saying, you know, at least every dollar that they invest needs to leverage at least $1 in purely private money, not commercial DFI financing, purely private money. Those incentives need to be put into place, and I think that will help a lot already getting the system to work better. And then last but not least, you know, we need to be very mindful how we deploy concessionality across the system. I'm just back in the multilateral system for 2 weeks now, so I'm not yet up to speed with all the proposals, but I get a little bit scared when I hear that there are billions and trillions being talked about to de-risk clean energy. Renewable energy is like, you know, the most bankable infrastructure sector we have, and we cannot clog up markets where private capital can already flow without any enhancement, and then, you know, close markets downstream in other sectors where it is needed most. So also a note of caution, and again, systemic solutions across MDBs, you know, open access, concessional windows where everybody can apply for standardized mechanisms, I think will help us get to scale faster than we have to date.
That is very important because it links to a point of adaptation. Putting the money on concessional money, MDB money, where the private sector doesn't see a revenue stream is very important. I'm sorry, but the clean energy, the revenue stream is there. We've got the challenges, but it's there. On the adaptation, folks don't see it. So I'm delighted that, you know, we will talk about this platform you launch. I'm delighted about the 70% adaptation that you're going to do it. You know, maybe you can prove some revenue streams in there, right? But that is a very important point. The governor of Brazil was telling me that, you know, they get all the MDBs knocking the Brazilian government now saying we want to put money into energy. The governor of Brazil says, I don't need money in energy. I need money in deforestation. Help me stop deforestation. Oh, but we don't see the return. Well, that's what I need money for.
That's a good point. Chris, last sort of... Christopher.
I mean, I'm happy to...
And then we can go to the audience for questions as we wrap up.
Just to say, as Astrid pointed out, we're in an era when there's pretty proactive talk of the reform of the multilaterals, which I really welcome. As an alum of two, I see them for all of their power, but also their shortcomings as they go through path dependence. I assure you, for renewable energy in Africa, I can't touch it. I can't touch it. I get crowded out, even in lovely places like Morocco, where I could do that. Wind project Morocco, any day, crowded out. Because the DFIs like to do the easy stuff. They don't want to do the unpleasant stuff. Don't even talk about decommissioning coal plants in the jet in Indonesia. Reputation risk, they can't touch it. Guess who gets asked to do this on the nasty work? So I welcome that. Thank you.
Thanks, Christopher. No, absolutely. I'm glad that we're having some of this free-flowing discussion. It is a tight and a tough topic, and I'd love to hear some questions from the audience today. Also, those that are online, please do drop your questions in the chat. Our colleagues are monitoring those. We have a roaming mic. Supposedly, Odd Girl's got it.
David Wilcox, Reach Scale. Everybody's used the term scale. Nobody's talked about scale. Let's define scale. Scale for Prime Minister Modi is 300 gigawatts minus 70 that he's got, which is 230. So scale for Prime Minister Modi would mean India would have to complete 4 500 megawatt projects every month for the next 10 years to reach Modi's goal. India's never done a 500 megawatt distributed project. It's done less than 5 500 megawatt projects, period. Gavin Newsom's favorite project is moving 187,000 acres out of farmland into renewable energy. That's 40 gigawatts. California would have to complete 80 500 megawatt projects by 2030, probably also about 4 months, to get to California's goal. The Prime Minister of Maharashtra can't finance his 500 megawatt project. It's his favorite project. It's the project that will deliver renewable energy to his citizens. It's on 119 locations of leased farmer land. We took it to every multilateral bank in virtually everyone in the world. They all choked because it was $120 million of equity. And nobody was going to put anything remotely close to that next to their job, risk-wise.
Sorry to interrupt. Just in the interest of time, if you have a...
If you want to talk scale, you've got to get the actual numbers on the table and then actually look at those numbers and think about answering the questions you're asking with those actual numbers on the table.
Thank you. Can someone come into the room, Mike?
I'll do the mic.
Thank you, sir.
Hi, I'm Louis. I'm with Manifest Climate. Thank you to the panelists. Christopher, you said there's not a natural market for this sort of early finance, but isn't part of the financial industry's role innovating, creating markets? And there's been a foundation of a market in VCM, in carbon removal. You can get venture capital for a lot of projects here. So I'm wondering to what extent new structured products like green securitizations, sort of synthetic securitizations, should there be more kind of financial innovation being put into these instruments, which then you may be able to sell to more people beyond these few Canadian pension funds?
No, thank you. And now I'm going to change my tone. There is the tools for doing this, and you see this in this country. Different tools, tax incentives, massive reorientation of people's level of comfort. The level of comfort to be achieved, whether the actual risk and the perceived risk is differentiated, we'll leave that aside. It's going to take from the multilaterals, moving themselves, as I said a second ago, out of spaces that are comfortable for them, letting private capital go into easy upper middle income, renewable energy, established technologies, and use their tools, as all the reform requests suggest, in new ways. Guarantee products, not just providing liquidity, attaching the insurance market to create much more capacity so you can provide that cover. All those tools are familiar. There's nothing terribly clever here. I was project manager for the securitization project that was discussed. Very familiar tools, but we're able to bring in a private sector partner. So I think the multilaterals play a fundamental role because they have the balance sheets. I did say the philanthropies and the UN specialized agencies are probably more punchy intellectually, but the power is with the multilaterals and they have the tools. The incentives have to be given to the colleagues within the institutions to move in that direction, and the donors who talk a lot, who own the institutions, have to give them more firepower, more equity support, more encouragement as they move for the reasons the colleagues said. These are trickier, the individual investment officers who don't want to lose their job. So all these partners need to be able to support. And as I said, my little jewels could be done at twice the size if you had more guarantee cover. So those tools can be achieved.
But the bond market has innovated. We have a 2.whatever trillion dollars of the green bonds or the thematic bonds. It's still only 2% of the bond market, right? So how do we take something that is already, I would argue, a proven success in terms of thematic debt instruments to a very large issue? And that is when I would bring back some guarantees, right? Not to projects, but to sovereigns. Why? Because the market is still not paying a green union. And the secondary market hasn't really kicked off. A lot of those bonds that, like the bonds, the $14 billion of bonds that we've been involved in UNDP, starting with the Mexico and the Indonesias, people are actually holding, you know, because they got net zero commitments, they got that kind of stuff. So they're holding those bonds. So you don't have a secondary market, and you don't have a green union being paid for those bonds. That's where a guarantee could come in, right, to make the cost of capital of those innovative bonds cheaper for the developing countries to issue, you know. And just on innovation, I think we have to innovate on swaps. I actually think there's like huge expectations, even in the political declaration of the SDG summit yesterday. There's maximized swaps, and you know, the instrument of that swaps for nature is highly inefficient, and is not really going to grow. Now, the concept of exchanging that for something could work at a much larger scale, the instrument that we have today, and that I think that's another innovation that could happen now.
No, I agree with all that has been said, but specifically about innovation. I think the multilateral institutions have a critical role to play here, and they do already have the instruments. It's about applying them in a different way to support clean energy projects or climate adaptation. I mean, Astrid and I worked in Cameroon on a fairly large thermal IPP back in the day, but we used a traditional instrument from the World Bank, a partial risk guarantee, that was ordinarily used to backstop sovereign risk. But we used it in a creative way to bring in local commercial banks and backstop refinancing risk. So I think that's sort of innovation, right? We already have the tools, we have the instruments. It's about pushing these institutions to use them in a creative way for some of these projects.
Hi, I'm Aaron from EDF. I have a question on the role you guys see. First, you guys play into the energy transition phase, especially as a developing country. As what they develop, as an increase in energy demand. And oil and gas and coal play that role into a lot of transition. First question, do you guys see Africa, like the lower-income country, they can leapfrog that fossil fuel phase? If yes, how do you see your organization or your world play into that role? And second question, in that brown to green transition, I'm glad that Chris mentioned that, of decommission of coal assets. I'm curious to see how does the financing, the transition financing play into that role? Thank you.
I'm going to stick with the just. Because whatever transition you're doing, coming from the United Nations Development Program, has to be just. What does that mean? You're going to decommission coal in South Africa or in Indonesia now. What are you going to do with the miners? The miners, the folks that are working on the mines. What are you going to do with them? What are you going to do with their families? What are they going to do with their communities? If you don't answer that questions, we're going to be committing the same mistakes we did in West Virginia in this country, or in Wales in the United Kingdom, and in other places of the world, right? So for us, it's very important that this whole process of just is not done on the back of the pool, okay? They are contributing. Forget about countries, right? Oxfam has a report that it publishes every year. The top 1%, the richest part of the globe, top 1% globally, right, emit more than 50%. Not comparing countries here, I'm comparing individuals on the income bracket. So don't transition on the back of the pool. Same argument for African fossil fuel. Sure, let's leapfrog the consumption or the source of energy for Africa, but are we going to tell Africa that they can't sell oil to the rest of the world and make hard currency so they can buy food? That's not fair. They haven't caused the problem.
I'm very grateful for the question, and I'm leaving Marcos to.
He's going to leave me for the politics.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, and I'm going to use different language than Marcus's point on what things that are fair and just. And it doesn't matter whether it's a CCGT new technology project in Bangladesh, which the World Bank refused to touch, or doing the offshore gas projects between Mauritania and Senegal, or even in the South African JETP program, doing anything that gets close to the existing production. The new renewables everyone wants to do. Even the grid. And the grid in Indonesia, PLN, for example, the grid needs to be built out to accommodate the new technological shift. Everyone gets that. But the grid will carry electrons that are not all clean. And I assure you, the investors that I speak to, these lovely Dutch pension funds, and that's okay, because the board can't handle that. That's what I'm saying. The renewables, all day long. The stuff that starts to touch gas, too ambiguous still. It'll all be done, I think, in the old-fashioned way. You have bilateral countries providing bilateral guarantees, and the project finance banks will do it in the old-fashioned way. That's, I think, is what will happen. I think the development partners will stand back.
One of the things, at the G20, next year in the Brazil presidency, there has been decided with US and China and Brazil and announced to the other members of the G20 to move down to the implementation what was agreed under the Indonesia presidency called the Transition Finance Framework. Brazil is selecting a sector to pilot this Transition Finance Framework, and one of the elements is that if you don't create it in today's world, some kind of acceptance to investors that is still good to fund brown to get to green, right? But with a clear path to green, so you don't wash, then you can't transition, right? Because everybody wants to fund the green, but we're not in the green world yet.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, just to answer your question very factually on what the Global Infrastructure Facility does in that context, as I mentioned earlier, we do prepare renewable energy projects and programs for investment across, solar, hydro, etc. We also are working on new technologies. We have a few green hydrogen projects in the pipeline that we will advise governments on structuring it correctly. And I couldn't agree more with you that, the energy transition for every country is very specific. And this is another area where all of us need to work together to identify the right net zero, low carbon, NDC aligned and just pathways that we all anchor our support in.
And I just wanted to mention in sub-Saharan Africa, maybe with the exception of South Africa, I mean, if you step away from some of the dogma around the energy transition and fossil fuels versus renewables, and you just look at the data and the facts. In a lot of cases with specific countries, it's from a cost perspective, it makes sense to pursue the clean energy route, right? And it's important that we support countries in doing that analysis and not just getting involved in the debate about fossil fuels and clean energy. So that would be my view.
Thanks, EJ. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for additional questions. What I will say is, given the recent news from the Global Stocktake report, we are dangerously far off 1.5 degrees, and that is something that everyone in this room, it needs to sink in thick and fast. I know we're moving quickly. Everyone in this room is working in climate change, climate finance. We've got the experts up here across the broad spectrum of different sectors, and we're covering different industries. We're looking at innovative solutions that are small, and small steps aren't going to win a really long race. This is not a sprint, it's a marathon. We must move quickly to start addressing project pipelines, the cost of capital, get investment committees on site, on board. Governments have a huge responsibility, donors, specifically to play in this role, as well as MDB reform and the like. But we've heard some of those practical solutions here today, the tools that are actually going to unlock that capital that we need for emerging markets and developing economies. And I hope everyone in the room can take something away from the conversations here today. Use that for the rest of the week. I hope everyone has a fantastic day. Please feel free to stick around and help yourself to some of the refreshments here, to introduce yourself to fellow participants and members of the panel. And give yourselves a round of applause for being an awesome audience. And thank you to our panel. Thank you so much, guys.